Sam Jacobs now, please, for Sharon Grant and Stafford Scott.
Good afternoon, sir.
I do apologise. I'm so sorry. No, forgive me. I'm getting in a muddle. Mr. Jacobs, you are now. You have now 20 minutes to address me on behalf of Sharon Grant and Stafford Scott, I think.
Thank you. Correct.
Yes.
So as you indicate, this is the opening statement on behalf of Sharon Grant, OBE, in relation to Bernie Grant, and from Stafford Scott further to his role on the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee. The statements will be brief so as not to repeat the opening statement of the cooperating group of non-police, non-state court participants. The group statement lays bare the shocking extent of how the SDS was mismanaged, the culture within the SDS, and the lack of accountability. Those concerns are adopted and endorsed on behalf of our clients. Before proceeding with the two individual statements, it is important for the inquiry to note that the documents disclosed have important implications for all of the clients represented by Bat Murphy, including those whose evidence will be heard in Tranche 3. As a result of the restriction orders, those clients in Tranche 3 have not yet had sight of the material disclosed for this set of hearings. Nevertheless, it is important for the inquiry to have the concerns of all court participants in mind when considering the evidence in these forthcoming hearings. The issue of how groups or individuals were selected for targeting by the SDS remains opaque, and the manager's statements shed little light on this important issue. For example, HN 109 claims that the managers were not directly involved in targeting decisions and that their directions came from S and C squads or directly from the security services, with any disputes being resolved by the commander operations. HN 61 does not even have a recollection of how targets were selected. And yet HN 115 gives a more detailed account whereby targets were identified within the SDS. There was consultation with the security services and the views of senior managers from other squads would be sought. It is vital to this inquiry that you, sir, fully consider all of the documents and material that might provide insight into the interests and concerns of the Metropolitan Police, which will have informed the apparently amorphous targeting strategy. The Special Branch report from January 1983, titled Political Extremism and the Campaign for Accountability within the Metropolitan Police, is a case in point. The report makes it plain that the police viewed any attempts to bring greater accountability to policing in the Metropolitan Police area as subversive in itself. It describes the attempts by the Greater London Council to develop monitoring groups as grandiose and sinister before seeking to discredit democratically elected officials on the GLC as having extremist connections. The so-called subversive aims of the GLC and these groups, as described in the document, include monitoring the police complaints procedure to ensure that it works effectively. There was clearly an intense interest in police accountability groups and justice campaigns, and it is the far more likely explanation for monitoring of such groups by undercover officers than it being only a byproduct of reporting on so-called subversive or extremist political groups. Indeed, that is confirmed by some of the new evidence from the managers. HN 115 accepts that the SDS would have been aware of the desire on the part of the managers for Special Branch to have an active role in pursuing further inquiries about these groups, with the express aim of allowing the police to respond to criticism. It is clear that the very notion of police accountability was viewed as problematic by Special Branch, and that the reporting on these groups and the various justice campaigns in the Tranche 2 period and beyond was a deliberate objective. It was not simply collateral reporting, as is asserted by HN 109 and others. An insight into the consequences of this approach appears again in the evidence of HN 115. He defines a group as being penetrated as meaning an officer being within an organisation and repeat reporting or attendance. That evidence puts a further complexion on the reference to the Cherry Gross Family Support Campaign, appearing as a group that was penetrated by the SDS in the 1985 annual report. So I turn to the specific opening statements, firstly on behalf of Sharon Grant, OBE. The evidence contained in the manager's witness statements on the reporting on elected officials has served only to muddy the waters and to raise further concerns for Sharon Grant concerning the reports filed on her husband throughout the time he served as an elected representative. The 1st of June 1988 briefing paper produced for the Security Services Management Board on counter-subversion refers to F-branch monitoring of various mainstream political groups, including the Labour Party. By contrast, HN 109 recalls a practice within the Metropolitan Police that there should be no active reporting on MPs and states that there were no separate instructions for the SDS. Given the extensive evidence now available about the collaborative approach between the SDS and the security services to the monitoring of subversion, it is difficult for Sharon Grant to accept that reporting on members of parliament by the SDS and Special Branch was either discouraged or was simply incidental. The inquiry will note that the reports on Bernie Grant and other members of parliament were frequently supplied to the security services. The manager's evidence on the issue is inconsistent. HN 69 and HN 109 claim that reports were filed on politicians only when they came into contact with other groups or where their attendance at events might lead to an increase in the numbers of people attending. HN 115 states that he cannot recall whether any guidance was given to UCOs about reporting on elected politicians, but he thinks it unlikely because it wasn't the practice of Special Branch, he says, to report on elected politicians. It does not appear, sir, that the manager's evidence on this issue is credible, and it is not supported by the documents available to the inquiry. First, it is very clear that Special Branch had a direct interest in the activities of elected politicians and that they did report on their activities. In the 1983 report on police accountability, there are references to dozens of elected officials with details of their purported political beliefs and allegiances. Bernie Grant is listed in this document due to his involvement with the Haringey Independent Police Committee. He is described by Special Branch not as an elected Labour politician, but as a supporter of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which in fact he was not. Second, the reports that were filed by UCOs on Bernie Grant contradict the assertion made. As was noted in the opening statement and the evidence of Sharon Grant for the Tranche 2 Part 1 hearings, those reports contain evaluations, assessments, and criticisms of the contents of Bernie Grant's speeches. None of the managers have exercised any editorial control over those reports, nor have they issued guidance to the UCOs about the inappropriateness of reporting on a Member of Parliament in this way. It is worth noting also that the interest of the Metropolitan Police and the SDS appears to be at its highest when Bernie Grant was critical of policing methods or of the police. This is consistent with the MPS being most concerned with its own reputation and its stated interest in using Special Branch reporting in order to defend itself from criticism. Sharon Grant has long held concerns that the Metropolitan Police was the source of unfavourable media stories about her husband, and the evidence disclosed to date heightens those concerns. I turn, sir, to the statement on behalf of Stafford Scott. The evidence of the managers disclosed to date has exacerbated Stafford Scott's concerns about the reasons why he and the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee were the subjects of reporting by undercover officers. As noted, the Metropolitan Police made it clear that they regarded any campaigns for police accountability and justice to be subversive by their very nature. Stafford Scott was involved in precisely this area of work by seeking to advance just and accountable policing in his community. The manager's statements assert that reporting on such groups and individuals was a byproduct of reporting on the political groups who became involved with or sought contact with them, and so was justified in the interests of public order. However, there is not one single report on Stafford Scott or of the activities of Broadwater Farm Defence Committee that raises any legitimate concerns about public order, nor is there evidence of manipulation of the group by political activists. To the contrary, the 1983 Special Branch document contains the details of two of the people who had key roles in establishing the youth and advice centres on Broadwater Farm and subsequently the Broadwater Farm Defence Committee. They are the distinguished Labour politician and community worker Martha Ossamore, now Baroness Ossamore, and Dolly Kiffin. But to Special Branch, pillars of the community such as this were to be characterised as political extremists. The extremism involved, so-called, is simply assisting and training people to make use of the police complaints process. The managers approved and submitted reports by undercover officers, yet did not seek to confront or address the racism that was so clearly prevalent. In two of the reports disclosed, speakers at public meetings are described in the reports as Negroes. In one of those reports, the meticulous and faultless research of one of the leading academics on policing, Paul Gilroy, was described as an attempt to create a hostile, biased view of relations between police and coloured people. It is a constant refrain of the submissions and statements made on behalf of the undercover officers and their managers that the language used in reports was reflective of its time and should not be judged by today's standards. And yet this is language that is more in tune with the segregated American Deep South than London in the 1980s. The assertions made by HN 109 that police accountability groups were not of interest, save for infiltration by the extreme left, and that HN 78 was tasked with infiltrating left-wing groups that might attempt to seize control of groups that were rooted in the minority community, are not credible against this background. In discussions with the security services and DCI Grey, HN 78 is referred to as a coloured potential recruit being considered for the SWP, even though the security services did not see the SWP as requiring an undercover officer. It is clear that he was regarded as a useful asset who would be able to obtain access that might not be available to other undercover officers. The language and attitude expressed in the reports shows that minorities were regarded as a threat by the Metropolitan Police whenever they sought to organise around issues of justice and of accountability. Finally, the extent to which these attitudes were entrenched throughout the SDS at every level is made clear by the failure of the managers to address or confront the tone and nature of the reporting. HN 59 is clear that managers did not instruct UCOs to report everything, and he states that managers would edit reports, sometimes removing words or phrases. HN 109 states that he had an editorial role over the reports, removing irrelevant or judgmental comments. And yet, despite this, explicitly racist language was clearly not seen as untoward or unusual and in need of editing. In the opening statement of the Commissioner for Part 1 of this tranche, it was acknowledged that there was unnecessary reporting on social justice campaigns, family campaigns, and community organisations. The Commissioner went on to identify a failure of the SDS management team in respect of inappropriate reporting and described the reporting on such groups as indefensible, resulting from a critical failure on the part of its managers. While the evidence in support of that admission is now before this inquiry, it has not come as a surprise to Stafford Scott, who has direct personal experience of the racism on display. He would ask the chair to be alive to his concern that these attitudes and behaviours do not operate in a vacuum, and the critical failures of the SDS managers were also critical failures on the part of the Metropolitan Police and the Home Office, and not just the individuals giving evidence to this inquiry. So those are our opening statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's now almost 1 o'clock. We will resume at